protecting our kids as best as we can, and also understanding the role that they play in this really historical family.
For years, one fragile thread appeared to survive every rupture between Meghan and the monarchy. Distance had grown, trust had collapsed, public battles had hardened private wounds. But one connection remained untouched, until King Charles made a decision so final that even those closest to the situation understood its meaning instantly. Meghan had survived separation from royal life before. This time, however, the palace was not creating distance. It was closing a door. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Meghan had already lived through years of separation from the world she once entered believing could become home. She and Harry had stepped away from frontline royal duties, leaving behind the daily responsibilities carried by working members of the monarchy. Yet some private connections had survived the fallout. The royal household, the staff and offices that support the sovereign and working royals, still represented a narrow institutional bridge between her new life and the family she had married into. That bridge now mattered precisely because almost everything else had changed. Arguments had become public, relationships had cooled, trust between California and the palace had become painfully fragile. Still, one limited channel remained, carrying more emotional meaning than its administrative purpose suggested. Then Charles removed it. In this dramatized account, the king ordered Meghan's final personal royal family access privilege withdrawn, ending the last palace-recognized route that gave her a special private connection to the working royal structure. The message reached her while Harry was nearby. She read it once. Then again, her hand lowered slowly, and she placed the phone down without speaking. He immediately understood that this was not another unpleasant headline or another temporary disagreement. He asked what had happened. Meghan answered quietly. His father had closed the last door. Harry reacted with anger almost immediately, but she remained still. What shook Meghan was not merely the loss itself. Charles had personally authorized it. She had believed that whatever disagreements existed between them, family history would protect this final connection from becoming part of the battle. The language destroyed that assumption. There was no review date, no temporary suspension, no sentence suggesting that warmer relations would automatically bring the privilege back. This was not a warning, it was a conclusion. Charles felt the weight from the opposite side. After approving the final authorization, he set his pen down and remained silent, before telling an aide that family affection and royal access could no longer be allowed to blur into the same thing. The king gained the clarity he believed the monarchy required. Yet the decision carried an unmistakable personal cost. Every institutional boundary placed around Meghan also reached Harry. Meghan initially believed months of tension had finally exhausted Charles's patience, but that was only part of it. One earlier encounter had changed the monarch's thinking completely, turning concern into resolve and hesitation into action. To understand why the king was prepared to sever the last surviving connection, the story must first return to the people trapped on opposite sides of a relationship that had already endured more damage than either wanted to admit. Behind the titles, statements, and carefully controlled palace language were three people carrying very different versions of the same history. Charles saw a monarchy that demanded boundaries. Harry saw a father who kept allowing institution to overpower family. Meghan saw something more complicated, a world she had left behind, but never entirely stopped affecting. The new order therefore struck deeper than protocol. It reopened every unresolved question about belonging, rejection, loyalty, and whether reconciliation had ever truly been possible. Charles carried the hardest contradiction, because he was not only a father trying to hold together a damaged family, he was also the sovereign, the person responsible for protecting the crown and the rules surrounding the working monarchy. That distinction mattered because every private choice involving Harry and Meghan could quickly become an institutional problem. Meghan stood outside that working structure now, yet she remained tied to it through marriage, public identity, family history, and her children's relationship with the House of Windsor. The royal family descended through the British sovereign. She could leave royal duties behind. She could not simply erase the history connecting her to them. Harry felt the decision as punishment. In a private conversation with Meghan, he told her the order was aimed at both of them, even if only her name appeared at the center of it. His anger came quickly. He wanted to challenge Charles, demand an explanation, and force the palace to admit why this final connection had been removed. Meghan reacted differently. She warned him that confronting his father immediately could turn one closed door into several more. Her restraint surprised him because he expected fury. Instead, she seemed wounded by something quieter, the possibility that Charles had made the choice personally. Charles felt that same wound from the other side. After advisors finished discussing the order at Windsor, he asked to remain alone for several minutes. The king understood that Windsor was more than a residence. It was one of the monarchy's central working homes, where family life and royal duty often collided. He had demanded a clear boundary, but clarity came at a price. Every restriction imposed on Meghan would be felt by Harry, and every step away from his daughter-in-law risked driving his son further away as well. Meghan kept returning to one detail. Charles had personally approved the final language. He had not simply allowed officials to tidy up an old administrative arrangement. He had placed his own authority behind the decision, making the rejection impossible to dismiss as routine palace housekeeping. That realization changed her understanding completely. Someone had wanted this boundary to be unmistakable. Harry remembered something else. Earlier private conversations had left him believing that certain family channels would remain protected even when public relations collapsed. Those assurances had given him one small reason to believe that personal connection could survive institutional conflict. Now that understanding appeared to have been overturned, and the reason was buried months earlier. One private royal gathering had changed everything. Meghan had asked for something Charles believed crossed a line. Harry had watched the tension rise, and the king had left that meeting with a question he could no longer ignore. What looked from the outside like another chapter in an old family feud had actually been accelerating toward this moment, since one private encounter changed Charles's view of where family ended and royal authority began. Every royal rupture has a moment that later feels inevitable. In this story, it did not begin with a television interview, a headline, or a public accusation. It began behind closed doors, during a private family gathering, where one conversation lasted only minutes, but left a permanent impression. Nothing dramatic happened at first. Voices remained controlled. No one stormed away. Yet when Charles eventually rose from his chair, something fundamental had changed, and those present sensed it. Charles had spent months trying to preserve narrow private bridges with Harry and Meghan, despite the damage already done. He believed completely shutting them out would make reconciliation almost impossible, especially when family ties still connected them through his son and grandchildren. Palace advisors, however, had warned him that personal access and official royal machinery were beginning to overlap in ways that created confusion. The royal household, meaning the staff and offices that support the sovereign and working royals, depended on strict channels, precisely because private conversations could quickly become public disputes. The king had resisted making those boundaries harsher. Then Windsor changed his mind. Meghan raised the issue directly during the private family meeting. She asked whether the remaining palace-recognized access arrangement could be expanded, so future communication involving her family would bypass several traditional household restrictions. Charles refused. He did not shout. He did not threaten. But the answer was immediate. She pressed him, arguing that the existing limits made genuine family communication feel almost impossible. To her, the restriction confirmed something she had feared for years. She could remain connected by marriage and family, yet still be treated as someone standing outside the circle when it mattered most. Charles held his position. He told Meghan that family relationships could not be used to create exceptions inside the working monarchy, because one special route would inevitably lead to arguments over where the next exception should begin. Harry, who was present for part of the exchange, grew visibly tense. He told his father that rigid rules had repeatedly turned personal problems into institutional battles. The king answered that blurred boundaries had done exactly the same thing. Neither man backed away. Meghan listened, and the silence between them became heavier than the argument itself. Then came the decision nobody in that room fully understood yet. After the meeting, Charles asked his private team for a complete review of every remaining privilege, access route, and informal exception connected to Meghan. That instruction was later preserved in a documented internal account, making clear that Windsor had become the trigger. What began as one disagreement was now being examined as a structural problem. Meghan would eventually discover that connection, and when she did, the meaning of the final order changed completely. It was no longer just the result of accumulated tension. It traced back to this room, this request, and this refusal. The Windsor conversation had planted the fuse, but the explosion came later, when Meghan and Charles were finally forced to confront what each believed the other had misunderstood. There are confrontations that explode because people lose control, and others that become more powerful because nobody does. When Meghan finally speaks directly with Charles about the decision, neither raises their voice at first. She wants one answer. Why was the final connection removed without giving her a chance to defend it? The king wants something different. He wants her to understand that, in his mind, the decision is no longer about one argument. It is about a boundary he believes cannot survive another exception. Harry had pushed for direct contact because he no longer trusted another exchange filtered through aides. Charles agreed, knowing that refusing to speak would make the decision feel even more personal. The conversation was deliberately kept small, without a large group of courtiers, the senior royal staff who normally help manage official business, surrounding them. That mattered because there was nowhere for either side to hide behind procedure. Meghan was not speaking to an institution now. She was speaking to the man who had personally authorized the order. Meghan asked the question without softening it. Was there ever actually a path back for me? Charles did not answer immediately. The pause lasted only seconds, but it hit harder than a refusal. She watched him choose his words, and in that hesitation, she heard every unresolved year between them. When the king finally spoke, he said the decision was not meant to erase her from the family. It was meant to separate family status from institutional privilege. Meghan pushed back. To her, that distinction sounded neat only on paper. Every formal separation had consequences for real relationships, and every closed royal channel made private reconciliation harder. Charles remained firm. He explained that the review triggered after Windsor had uncovered several informal exceptions that survived long after Meghan stopped being a working royal. Those arrangements, he said, created confusion about what access she still held and what role she actually occupied. The king believed allowing them to continue would preserve ambiguity the monarchy could no longer afford. Meghan listened carefully, and the scale of the decision finally became clear. This had not been one angry reaction to one difficult conversation. It had been a deliberate review, followed by a deliberate dismantling. That realization changed the emotional balance. Meghan had entered wanting to know why she had been blindsided. She left knowing something worse. Charles had considered the issue in detail and still chosen final separation. Yet he also made clear that family contact itself had not been forbidden. The line he drew was institutional. even if the pain it caused was deeply personal. But one question remained. If this boundary was designed to survive beyond Charles, then the future king had to matter. William's position could no longer remain in the background. Meghan left the conversation understanding that the king had made the choice, but she also realized something more unsettling. The future monarchy was already shaping which royal relationships would survive after him. Charles signed the order, but one question immediately began to haunt Meghan and Harry. How much did William know? The Prince of Wales represented more than an older brother inside this crisis. He represented the future architecture of the monarchy itself. If Charles's decision was meant to establish a permanent boundary, rather than a temporary punishment, then William's attitude mattered enormously. And when Harry finally sought clarity, the answer he received was far more controlled and far more painful than he expected. William understood why the issue could not remain purely personal. As heir, he stood next in line to the throne, which meant decisions affecting the future shape of royal access would eventually become his responsibility too. The working monarchy, the smaller group of family members carrying official duties on behalf of the crown, depended on clear limits, because blurred roles had already caused years of confusion and resentment. Yet the prince also knew that Harry was not simply another relative outside the institution. He was his brother. Every rule carried history with it, and every boundary could reopen wounds neither man had managed to close. Harry asked him directly during a private conversation. Had he supported removing Meghan's final access? William did not answer quickly. He chose each word with almost painful care, saying he had supported clarity, not humiliation. That distinction only angered his brother more. Harry accused him of turning family pain into an administrative problem, something that could be solved by rules, procedures, and closed channels. The future king pushed back. He reminded him that ignoring boundaries had repeatedly made private disagreements worse, because every exception eventually became another argument over who was entitled to what. William then confirmed the detail Harry had feared. He had been consulted during the wider review. Charles had made the final decision, but the heir had been asked for his view on how these arrangements might affect the monarchy in the years ahead. He had not demanded punishment. He had supported ending ambiguity. That mattered, because the decision was no longer tied only to one reign. It reflected a principle the next sovereign appeared prepared to carry forward. Meghan absorbed that information with a different kind of shock. She had already accepted that Charles wanted the distinction between family and institution made permanent. Now she understood that William did too. The message was unmistakable. Non-working members of the family would no longer be allowed to hold special institutional privileges simply because emotional or blood ties remained. Her situation had become the test case for a much larger royal boundary. Harry's anger slowly changed into something heavier. If William intended to preserve the same line when his own reign eventually came, then waiting for circumstances to change would accomplish nothing. This was not a temporary dispute with their father. It was becoming the architecture of the monarchy they had left behind. The confrontation restored nothing. Instead, it forced Harry and Meghan to face the reality waiting beneath the anger. Daily life would now have to continue around a door that was not going to reopen. The most painful consequences do not always arrive during the argument. Sometimes they arrive afterward, in the silence. Once the calls are finished and the palace decision remains unchanged, Meghan is left confronting a reality that cannot be shouted away. Harry has anger to hold on to. Charles has duty. William has certainty. But Meghan must now decide what the loss means for her personally. Because the last formal thread connecting her directly to royal machinery has disappeared, and no confrontation has brought it back. Meghan feels the practical change almost immediately. Communications that once moved through a limited direct route now have to pass through ordinary family or legal channels, with no special royal access attached. That matters, because access was never just about convenience. It represented a surviving connection to the royal household, the staff and offices that manage the sovereign's official work. Palace staff quietly update internal procedures and treat the matter as settled rather than temporary. There is no dramatic announcement inside those offices, just a change in process. And somehow, that makes the finality feel even colder. Harry sits with her after confirmation arrives that there will be no reconsideration. He expects anger. Instead, Meghan tells him she does not want another public war fought in her name. The answer catches him off guard. He had been preparing himself for another confrontation with Charles, another argument over fairness, another attempt to force the palace to reconsider. She stops him before that anger can gather momentum. Fighting again, she says, would only keep their future tied to a decision they cannot control. Harry takes that personally. He begins blaming himself, convinced that years of conflict with the institution helped create the circumstances now falling on his wife. Meghan refuses to let him carry all of it. She tells him that if they continue measuring their life by every rejection from Britain, then the monarchy will still be deciding how they feel long after they left it. The words are quiet, but the meaning is sharp. She is done asking permission to move forward. Meghan then makes the choice that changes everything. She will not request restoration of the privilege again. No appeal, no renewed campaign, no attempt to persuade Charles through another private channel. For the first time since the order arrived, she is no longer reacting to the king's decision. She is defining the separation herself. Charles hears through a documented internal account that Meghan will not challenge the ruling. Relief does not come. Instead, the king grows unexpectedly subdued. He wanted clarity, but her silence confirms that the boundary has become more than administrative. It has become emotional. Harry still cannot leave it there. One question remains between him and his father, and this time no advisor can answer it. The institutional battle is over, but the human reckoning is only beginning, and it will take one private conversation between father and son to change the meaning of everything that came before. For once, there are no aides explaining policy, no statements being drafted, and no advisors waiting outside to translate emotion into royal language. Charles and Harry speak as father and son. The privilege has already been removed. Meghan has decided not to fight for its return. Nothing practical is left to negotiate. That is precisely what makes the conversation different. With the battle effectively finished, both men are finally able to admit what the argument had been hiding. Harry asks for one final private conversation, not because he believes the decision can still be reversed, but because he needs to know whether his father sees the family relationship itself as finished. Charles agrees, with one condition. They will not debate access, protocol, or institutional status. Those terms matter, because royal access means permission to use official palace channels and privileges tied to the working monarchy. For the first time in this crisis, the structure surrounding them is deliberately stripped away. What remains is simpler and far more painful. Harry tells his father that every new palace boundary feels like another personal rejection. He says the rules may look clean from the inside, but from where he stands, each one feels like proof that the family keeps moving further away. Charles answers that every request for exceptions frightens him for the opposite reason. He believes private reconciliation cannot survive if it is constantly tied to questions of official access. The king tells his son that he wants family contact to exist without becoming another argument over royal standing. Harry listens, but the hurt does not disappear. Charles then admits something he had not said during the earlier confrontations. Signing the order hurt him, because he knew exactly how Harry would read it. The monarch had expected anger. He had expected accusation. What he had not expected was Meghan's silence afterward. Harry admits that her refusal to appeal frightened him too. To him, it meant she had stopped expecting the palace to make room for her again. The absence of another fight suddenly felt more final than the fight itself. Charles makes the boundary unmistakably clear. Meghan's royal access will not return. But he refuses to treat the end of that institutional connection as the end of all family contact. Harry does not forgive the decision, and he does not pretend the damage is gone. Yet he finally stops demanding reversal. That is the turning point. Acceptance without agreement. Pain without another battle. Father and son leave the conversation without victory, but with something more fragile: clarity. It does not heal everything. It does not restore what was removed, but it changes the meaning of what comes next. Because once the palace boundary becomes public, their intensely private wound is no longer theirs alone. It becomes a global royal spectacle, interpreted through headlines, crowds, broadcasters, and decades of unresolved family history. By morning, a decision that had been argued in private rooms belongs to everyone. Commentators dissect it, supporters defend it, critics condemn it. Every old grievance surrounding Meghan, Harry, Charles, and William is dragged back into the light. Yet amid the noise, one image captures the mood better than any panel discussion. People standing outside Buckingham Palace, beneath competing headlines, arguing not merely about protocol, but about what a family owes one another when one member walks away. Meghan understands immediately that the story has escaped the narrow language of royal procedure. British and international coverage frames the removal as one of the clearest signs yet that her relationship with the working monarchy has moved from uneasy separation to formal distance. The palace keeps its message controlled, describing the change as administrative clarity rather than punishment. That phrase matters, because administrative clarity means defining exactly who holds official access and responsibilities inside the royal system. But outside those walls, the argument is far more emotional. Commentators connect the decision to years of Sussex-Windsor tension, old interviews, family fractures, and every public wound that never fully healed. Harry watches the coverage become increasingly personal. The discussion shifts from access and protocol to whether Charles has rejected his son through Meghan. He listens until one commentator turns the decision into a judgment on his marriage, then switches off the television. Meghan tells him not to respond. She reminds him that arguing with every headline would drag them straight back into the cycle they had just decided to leave. Harry resists at first, but her calm forces him to recognize something painful. Public outrage cannot reopen a private door. Charles faces the same storm from the other side. An aide presents the morning coverage and explains how heavily the story is being framed as father against son. The king looks weary rather than victorious. He had wanted a boundary, not another public family war. Yet the distinction is already disappearing in the headlines. The very decision meant to create institutional clarity has become emotional spectacle. Outside Buckingham Palace, the division becomes impossible to ignore. A crowd gathers as one newspaper front page carries the words, "Final Royal Link Cut." Some people photograph it. Others argue over whether Charles has protected the crown or deepened an already painful family fracture. One headline has reduced years of private conflict to 4 brutal words. William refuses to make it worse. He instructs his team that there will be no triumphant briefing, no language suggesting Meghan has been defeated, and no attempt to score a public victory. The future king understands that triumph would turn a boundary into humiliation. When the noise finally begins to fade, one truth remains untouched by headlines. Nobody has truly won. But Charles, Meghan, Harry, and William now know exactly where the line stands. And what each of them does after this moment will determine its final meaning. In the end, there is no dramatic reversal. No secret order restores what was removed. No emotional plea persuades Charles to undo his signature. Meghan's last formal link to the working royal household remains gone. Yet the true conclusion is not simply that a privilege disappeared. The deeper change is that every person involved finally stops pretending the old arrangement can survive. Charles chooses institutional clarity. Meghan chooses independence. Harry chooses reluctant acceptance. And the monarchy chooses a boundary it intends to keep. Meghan receives the final correspondence and understands there is nothing left to negotiate. The royal household, meaning the offices and staff that support the sovereign and working members of the monarchy, no longer recognizes any special personal access for her. That matters because the decision ends the last remaining institutional exception connected to her old royal position. It does not erase her marriage to Harry, her place in family history, or her children's connection to the king. But it draws a hard line between belonging to a family and holding privileges inside its working royal structure. Meghan closes the correspondence and tells Harry she does not want him asking again. He hesitates, then takes her hand and agrees. For the first time since the order arrived, neither of them treats restoration as the goal. Harry still believes the decision was painful and unnecessary, but he understands that continuing to fight would keep their future trapped inside the same argument. She reaches a different conclusion. If palace recognition is no longer available, then it can no longer be the measure of whether her life has meaning. Charles reaches his own quieter verdict. In a documented private conversation, he speaks about Harry without anger and makes clear that his son remains family, even though the institutional door will stay closed. The king does not pretend the choice came without cost. Protecting the boundary he believes the crown requires has widened a personal distance he cannot repair through policy. The pain remains. The ambiguity does not. William accepts the same distinction. The future king understands that Meghan and Harry remain connected through blood, marriage, memory, and private relationships. But royal access will no longer serve as proof of belonging. That principle now stretches beyond one argument and beyond one reign. Meghan's blindsiding therefore becomes something larger than defeat. It forces her to stop measuring her place through the Windsors, while Charles must accept that institutional certainty can create personal loss. Harry lets go of the hope that one restored privilege could repair years of damage. The monarchy emerges more clearly defined, but emotionally scarred. There is nowhere else for the dispute to go. The royal door Charles closed remains closed. Meghan turns toward the life she has built beyond it, and the family faces one final truth. They may remain related, even when they no longer belong to the same royal world. The last formal link is gone, and with it, the long uncertainty finally ends. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.